Something is happening across the Strait of Hormuz right now that represents the most significant shift in this crisis since it began. Not because of what you are seeing in the headlines. Actually, the headlines are covering this exactly backward. Within the past hours, the Islamic Republic of Iran has executed a coordinated multi-target campaign across the United Arab Emirates and the wider Persian Gulf maritime environment that, taken together, constitutes the operational end of the equilibrium that has governed the region since the April 8th ceasefire. The port of Fujairah, the principal commercial maritime hub on the Gulf of Oman coast and the bunkering capital of the Eastern Hemisphere, has been struck by Iranian drone action, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Cybercorps Telegram channel posting visual material claiming responsibility for the operation. The Fujairah Petroleum Industries Zone, the storage and processing complex that sits adjacent to the port, has burned through the night following the impact of an Iranian drone on the VTTI tank farm jointly owned by the Vitol Group, the Abu Dhabi National Energy Company, and the IFM Global Infrastructure Fund. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company tanker Baraka was struck by two Iranian drones during its transit through the strait. A South Korean-operated vessel anchored in the strait suffered an explosion and fire that the South Korean government has now confirmed. The British military's United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Centre reported two additional cargo vessels burning off the UAE coast. A residential building housing foreign workers in Oman's Musandam Peninsula, which forms the southern land border of the strait, was struck, injuring two foreign nationals. The UAE Ministry of Defense reported its air defenses engaged 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, and 4 unmanned aerial vehicles directed against multiple targets across the country. 4 missile alerts sounded across Dubai and Abu Dhabi for the first time since the ceasefire took hold in early April. In response, United States Navy forces operating under the Project Freedom operational framework that President Trump announced Sunday evening engaged Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy small boats targeting commercial shipping, sinking 6 of those boats according to United States Central Command, with subsequent reporting indicating the figure has reached 7. The commercial press is reporting these events as a renewed exchange of fires within the existing crisis, as another round of escalation in the broader U.S.-Iran confrontation, as a regrettable but predictable test of the ceasefire framework that has held since early April. That framing is not just incomplete, it is wrong in a way that obscures the single most consequential operational fact that has been demonstrated across the past 24 hours. Because what has actually occurred is not a renewed exchange of fires within an existing framework. It is the structural collapse of the framework itself. The dual blockade equilibrium that governed the Persian Gulf for nearly 4 weeks under the April 8th truce, Iran maintaining its de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the United States maintaining its counter-blockade of Iranian ports under the operations that have been conducted since April 13th, and both sides accepting the costly but stable arrangement as the cost of the broader ceasefire, has ended. The Project Freedom operation, which Trump announced as a humanitarian initiative to guide stranded vessels out of the strait, but which Iran characterized through its diplomatic and military channels as a violation of the ceasefire and an attempt to break Iran's principal source of strategic leverage, broke the equilibrium by attempting to reopen the strait without Iranian consent. The Iranian response over the past hours has now demonstrated that the equilibrium cannot be unilaterally reset. The new operational geometry that has replaced it treats every actor in the Persian Gulf as an active participant rather than a bystander to a bilateral U.S.-Iran confrontation. The question that matters is not which specific incidents have occurred over the past day. The question is what the structural collapse of the dual blockade equilibrium means for every actor whose calculations have been built upon that equilibrium's persistence. The answer to that question reveals why the strategic geometry of the Persian Gulf has just fundamentally broken, and why the broader ceasefire framework that Pakistani mediation produced in April has effectively expired even though no party has formally renounced it. To understand what has actually happened, you have to understand the specific structure of the dual blockade equilibrium that has governed the past 4 weeks and why the equilibrium had become the operational reality rather than merely an interim arrangement. The equilibrium emerged from the specific circumstances of the April 8th ceasefire negotiations, which produced agreement on the cessation of direct hostilities between American and Iranian military forces, but which left unresolved the 2 principal points of contention that had triggered the broader war: the status of the Iranian nuclear program and Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. With those issues unresolved, both sides established blockade postures designed to impose ongoing economic costs on the other while remaining technically within the bounds of the ceasefire. Iran maintained its closure of the Strait of Hormuz, citing maritime safety concerns and the requirement for vessels to coordinate with Iranian authorities, but in practical terms preventing the normal commercial transit that had previously characterized the waterway. The United States, beginning April 13th, established a naval blockade of Iranian ports, conducting interdiction operations against Iranian-flagged and Iranian-controlled tonnage attempting to transit through the Persian Gulf to and from Iranian terminals. Each blockade imposed substantial economic costs on the targeted party. The Iranian closure cost the global economy through elevated oil prices, with American gasoline prices reaching approximately $4.44 per gallon, according to ADNOC reporting, compared to around $3.17 the prior year. The American blockade cost the Iranian regime through the deprivation of foreign exchange revenues that the regime depends upon for its operations. The equilibrium was sustainable in the sense that neither side wished to escalate beyond it given the costs of full-scale combat operations, but it was not sustainable in the sense that the underlying economic costs were imposing increasing pressure on both sides over time. The Iranian 14-point proposal submitted through Pakistani mediation channels was the diplomatic expression of the Iranian effort to convert the equilibrium into a settlement on terms favorable to Tehran. The American Project Freedom announcement was the operational expression of the American effort to break the Iranian leverage point that the strait closure represented. Both efforts attempted to alter the equilibrium without breaking the ceasefire. Both efforts failed to produce that outcome, and the past day's events demonstrate that the equilibrium has not survived the attempts to alter it. But there is a second thing almost no one is connecting properly. The Iranian response over the past day has not been a single retaliatory strike against American operations. It has been a coordinated multi-target campaign that demonstrates a specific Iranian operational concept. The targeting profile reveals the concept clearly. The port of Fujairah was selected because it represents the specific UAE infrastructure that was supposed to provide insulation from Strait of Hormuz disruption, the bunkering, storage, and export complex on the Gulf of Oman coast that operates outside the strait itself. The ADNOC tanker Baraka was selected because it represents the operational use of the strait by UAE state-linked commercial assets in defiance of the Iranian closure. The third country shipping, including the South Korean-operated vessel, was selected because it represents the broader pattern of commercial transit that Project Freedom is attempting to enable. The Oman residential building strike, regardless of whether it was a deliberate target or an interception failure, communicates that Omani territory is not insulated from the consequences of the broader confrontation, despite Oman's traditional role as the mediating state between Tehran and Washington. The cumulative targeting profile demonstrates that the Iranian operational concept treats the entire Persian Gulf maritime and littoral environment as a single battle space in which any actor, UAE, Oman, third country shipping, American forces, that participates in the disruption of Iranian leverage becomes a legitimate target. This is a categorically different operational concept than the one Iran has previously employed, even during the most intense periods of the broader war. Previous Iranian operations had maintained a degree of targeting calibration designed to limit horizontal escalation. The current campaign has abandoned that calibration. The Tasnim news agencies reported warning, citing an unnamed military source, that all UAE interests would become Iranian targets if Abu Dhabi takes what Tehran assesses as unwise action, indicates the explicit Iranian articulation of the new concept. This reveals something fundamental about the limits of the assumption that has governed Gulf state planning since the broader war began. The assumption was that the Gulf Cooperation Council states could maintain a position of formal neutrality from the bilateral U.S.-Iran confrontation while continuing to host American forces and infrastructure. The assumption was that Iran would treat that formal neutrality as substantive and would therefore exclude Gulf state assets from its targeting cycles. The past day demonstrates that the assumption has been invalidated. The formal neutrality of the Gulf states does not provide substantive insulation. The Gulf states have become participants in the war whether or not their political leaderships have chosen that role. The first thing you need to understand to make sense of the strategic implications is the specific concept that planners refer to as the involuntary belligerent. An involuntary belligerent is a state that becomes a participant in an armed conflict not through its own decision, but through the operational targeting decisions of other parties. The status carries specific consequences. The state must defend itself against attacks that it did not provoke through its own military action. The state must absorb economic and political costs from the conflict without having authorized those costs through its own deliberative processes. The state must navigate the diplomatic complexities of being attacked while having maintained formal neutrality. And the state must determine its operational response under conditions where retaliation would convert the involuntary status into voluntary belligerency. The United Arab Emirates has now been placed in this status by Iranian targeting decisions over the past day. The Sultanate of Oman, despite its traditional mediating role, has been at minimum touched by the same dynamic through the Musandam Peninsula incident. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have not yet been struck, but have issued statements indicating the depth of their concern about the strike pattern. The cumulative effect is that the entire Gulf Cooperation Council is now operating under conditions where its members must reassess the strategic premises that have governed their relationships with Iran since the broader war began. The reassessment cannot be deferred. The strikes are occurring now. The political pressure for response within each Gulf state's domestic constituencies is rising in real time. The Saudi and Qatari condemnations indicate that the regional political environment has shifted in ways that make the previous neutrality posture difficult to maintain. The Gulf states must therefore choose between three options that all carry substantial costs. They can attempt to maintain the neutrality posture despite its demonstrated inadequacy, accepting continued Iranian targeting as the cost of the position. They can shift toward more active participation in the American-led effort to address the Iranian threat, accepting the escalation that participation would generate. Or they can attempt to negotiate directly with Tehran to secure exemption from Iranian targeting, accepting the diplomatic concessions that such negotiation would require. Each option carries costs the Gulf states have spent decades attempting to avoid, and the choice among them is now forced. The second thing the Western press is missing is the specific structural relationship between Project Freedom and the broader American operational complex that has been established in the region. Project Freedom is not a standalone humanitarian initiative as the Trump administration has framed it. It is the operational extension of the naval blockade of Iranian ports that has been in effect since April 13th, executed through the same forces that have been conducting the blockade and managed through the same combined maritime forces and Fifth Fleet Command architecture. The CENTCOM commander, Adam Brad Cooper, has explicitly described the operation as supporting the broader campaign against Iran, with the operation involving guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and approximately 15,000 service members. The USS Abraham Lincoln has launched FA-18 Super Hornets in support of the operation. The operation is structured as a layered defensive umbrella across the strait rather than as discrete escort missions for individual vessels, reflecting the operational planner's assessment that close escort operations would be impractical given the geographic constraints of the strait and the dispersed nature of the Iranian threat. The Iranian response to Project Freedom has therefore not merely been a response to a humanitarian gesture, it has been a response to the operational extension of the existing American pressure campaign in a manner that Iran has assessed as breaking the dual blockade equilibrium. The French government's explicit refusal to participate, articulated by President Macron during a meeting in Armenia, has exposed a significant fissure in the Western coalition supporting the broader American posture. France's preferred alternative, a coordinated reopening negotiated between the United States and Iran rather than a unilateral American operation, represents the diplomatic option that the dual blockade equilibrium had been preserving as a future possibility. Project Freedom's unilateral character has foreclosed that option, at least in the short term, by demonstrating that the United States will pursue its preferred outcome through operational means rather than through the multilateral diplomatic process that France and other European partners would have preferred. This reveals something fundamental about the limits of the coalition architecture that has supported the broader American campaign. The coalition has held together through the active combat phases of the war when the operational requirement was clear and the political stakes were high. The coalition is now showing strain in the post-ceasefire phase when the operational decisions have shifted toward more discretionary applications of pressure. France's position indicates that the European partners are no longer prepared to subordinate their own preferences to American operational decisions when the decisions involve initiatives that the Europeans assess as escalatory rather than defensive. The coalition fracture, while not yet operationally significant, indicates that the political architecture supporting sustained American operations has become more fragile than its prior performance indicated. This reveals something fundamental about the limits of the strategic concept that has guided American operations since the April 8th ceasefire. The concept has rested on the proposition that sustained economic pressure through the naval blockade of Iranian ports, combined with the gradual restoration of commercial transit through the Strait of Hormuz, would produce the conditions for a settlement on American terms. The proposition required two assumptions to hold simultaneously. First, that Iran would accept the asymmetric pressure of the blockade without escalating beyond the equilibrium framework. Second, that the gradual restoration of transit could be achieved through the demonstration of capability without triggering Iranian counteraction that would prevent the restoration. Both assumptions have now been invalidated by the past day's events. Iran has escalated beyond the equilibrium framework through the multi-target strike campaign. The attempted restoration of transit through Project Freedom has triggered exactly the counteraction the second assumption excluded. The strategic concept therefore faces a choice between revision and intensification. Revision would involve accepting that the Iranian closure of the strait will persist as long as the bilateral confrontation persists, and adjusting American economic and diplomatic strategy accordingly. Intensification would involve expanding American operations to a degree that overcomes Iranian resistance through direct action, accepting the costs and risks of returning to active combat operations against Iran. The choice between these options is now the principal strategic decision facing the American administration, and the decision cannot be deferred indefinitely because the operational developments are continuing to compound while deliberation occurs. The third thing, and this is the piece that demonstrates why the Pakistani-mediated ceasefire framework has effectively expired even though no party has formally renounced it, is the specific structure of how ceasefire frameworks function in practice and what it takes for them to remain operationally meaningful. A ceasefire framework requires three conditions to function. First, the absence of significant kinetic engagement between the principal parties. Second, the maintenance of the framework's terms by all parties through their operational behavior. Third, the continued recognition by all parties that the framework provides the basis for further negotiation toward a more comprehensive settlement. The first condition has now been violated by the past day's events. United States naval forces have engaged Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy assets in direct kinetic combat, sinking 6 to 7 Iranian boats. Iran has struck United Arab Emirates infrastructure, third country commercial shipping, and territory of an additional Gulf state. The exchange does not yet constitute the resumption of full-scale combat operations between the principal parties, but it is no longer an absence of significant kinetic engagement. The second condition has been violated by both parties' interpretation of the framework's terms. Iran assesses Project Freedom as a violation of the ceasefire. The United States assesses the Iranian closure of the strait and the strikes against Allied infrastructure as violations of the ceasefire. The framework cannot survive when both parties are simultaneously claiming that the other has violated it while denying their own actions constitute violations. The third condition is being progressively eroded by the demonstrated inability of the framework to produce movement toward a more comprehensive settlement. Iran has submitted a 14-point proposal that Tehran assesses as a serious basis for negotiation. The United States has not accepted the proposal as such. The mediating channels through Pakistan and other partners are continuing to function, but they are functioning in an environment where the principal parties have demonstrated they will pursue operational options when diplomatic options do not produce their preferred outcomes. The framework is therefore expiring not through formal denunciation, but through the cumulative effect of the conditions that sustained it being violated faster than they can be restored. The expiration is functionally complete even though no announcement of expiration has been made, and the expiration changes the nature of every subsequent decision that the parties must make. And this is where the strategic geometry of the Persian Gulf breaks. For nearly 4 weeks, since the April 8th ceasefire took effect, the operational reality of the Persian Gulf has rested on a specific structure. The structure was costly, contested, and unstable, but it was stable enough to function as an equilibrium because the alternative was the resumption of full combat operations that all parties wished to avoid. The structure has now broken. The dual blockade has been replaced by active hostile maritime operations across the entire Gulf. The Gulf Cooperation Council states have been converted from bystanders to participants. The European coalition has fractured along lines that may widen further. The strategic concept guiding American operations has been confronted with the empirical invalidation of its core assumptions. The Pakistani-mediated ceasefire framework has functionally expired. What replaces these structures is not yet clear. The replacement could be the resumption of full combat operations between the United States and Iran, with all the regional and global consequences that resumption would carry. The replacement could be a new framework constructed under more difficult conditions to account for the lessons of the past month. The replacement could be a sustained low-intensity confrontation that does not return to full combat, but does not stabilize into an equilibrium either. The specific shape of the replacement will be determined by decisions that the principal actors must make in the coming days and weeks, and the decisions will be made under conditions of compressed time, elevated political pressure, and reduced diplomatic flexibility. The geometry that governed the past 4 weeks is gone. The geometry that will govern the next phase has not yet been established. Your watch window over the next 48 to 72 hours is concrete and specific. Watch for any additional Iranian strikes against Gulf Cooperation Council infrastructure, particularly Saudi facilities at Yanbu or Ras Tanura, Qatari facilities at Ras Laffan, or Kuwaiti facilities at Mina al-Ahmadi, because expansion of the targeting beyond the UAE and Oman would confirm that Tehran has indeed adopted the operational concept that the Tasnim warning indicated. Watch for any movement of additional United States Navy assets into the Persian Gulf area of operations beyond the forces currently engaged, including any redeployment of carrier strike groups from other theaters, any acceleration of the carrier strike group rotation schedule, or any deployment of additional Marine Expeditionary Unit forces from forward operating positions. Watch for the operational posture of the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, particularly whether ADNOC continues operations at full capacity or implements partial shutdowns, because the operational decision will reveal the assessment that UAE leadership has made about continued infrastructure security. Watch for any communications from the Sultan of Oman or the Qatari Emir regarding the status of mediation channels, because the formal acknowledgement that the channels are no longer functioning would indicate that the diplomatic infrastructure supporting the broader ceasefire framework has failed. Watch for any movements in commercial shipping patterns, particularly the willingness of major commercial operators to participate in the Project Freedom Transit Corridor, or the alternative decision by these operators to continue avoiding the strait entirely. Watch for any formal statements from the Trump administration regarding the status of the ceasefire framework, because the administration's specific characterization of recent events will determine whether the framework is acknowledged as having expired, or whether the administration attempts to maintain the position that the framework remains in effect despite the operational developments. And watch for the specific behavior of the global crude oil markets, because market movements over the coming days will provide the most reliable real-time indicator of how informed observers assess the probability of full combat resumption versus the probability of new equilibrium formation. The drones reached the port of Fujairah. The tank farms continued to burn. The tanker was attacked. The cargo vessels are ablaze. The South Korean ship suffered explosion and fire. The Oman residential building was struck. The IRGC boats were sunk. The American merchant vessels transited the strait. The missile alerts sounded across Dubai and Abu Dhabi. The defensive umbrella deployed. France refused to join. Saudi Arabia and Qatar condemned. The 14-point proposal sits on the table without acceptance. The dual blockade equilibrium has ended. The Gulf Cooperation Council states have become involuntary belligerents. The European coalition has fractured. The strategic concept has been confronted with the invalidation of its assumptions. The Pakistani-mediated ceasefire has functionally expired. The replacement geometry has not been established. The balance of power across the Strait of Hormuz has not shifted. It has fundamentally broken.